In 1530, a royal banquet at Hampton Court Palace produces hundreds of dishes for the court of Henry VIII. Meat arrives in barrels of salt. It sits in stone larders without refrigeration. Cooks trim away the spoiled music edges before the rest goes to the fire. What reaches the table is masked with expensive spices, presented on gold plate and arranged to look like abundance. But the food itself tells a different story. This is what was actually eaten at a Tudor feast and why most of it was barely edible. Step into the Great Hall at Hampton Court on the night of a royal banquet. The space is vast. Tapestries cover the stone walls, thick enough to dull music the cold. Hundreds of beeswax candles burn in iron sconces. Smoke rises from the central hearth and hangs in the upper reaches of the room. The air is hot, dense, and loud. Minstrels play from the gallery. Servants move in coordinated lines. Diners fill long tables that music stretch the length of the hall. The noise alone is overwhelming. Voices, music, footsteps, music, the clatter of pewter on wood. Then observe the room's structure. Near the center of the high table sits a large ornate salt cellar. It is made of silver, decorated with enamel and small figures. It is not decorative. It is a boundary. To be seated above the salt means you are of high rank. You sit near the king. You receive the first servings. The meat is hotter. The wine is better. The attention of the room follows your movements. To be below the salt means you are farther from power. You wait longer. Your food has music traveled farther. Your position in the room is a public verdict on your status. Visible music to everyone present. Now watch as the subtleties arrive. These are sculptures made of marzipan, sugar paste, and pastry. They depict castles, saints, coats of arms. One shows a lion and a dragon locked in music combat. Their bodies built from layers of colored sugar. These pieces are carried in on wooden platforms and placed on the high table. They are not meant to be eaten. They exist to be admired, to demonstrate expense and artistry. The court applauds. The subtlety glitters in the candlelight. And while the room marvels at this inedible monument, the actual food, roasted, music salted, smoke choked, waits in the kitchens, already beginning its descent into the hall, already dividing itself by rank. Leave the great hall. Move through a stone corridor toward the source of the heat. The great kitchens at Hampton Court are not a single room. They are a complex of specialized chambers. Slaughterhouses, pastry rooms, larders, boiling houses, each with its own function. The largest space contains a series of fireplaces. Some are over 6 feet high. A grown man can stand inside them. They burn constantly during a banquet, fed with oak and charcoal. The air is thick with smoke. It stings your eyes. It coats your throat. Visibility drops to a few feet in the densest areas near the fires. Everything cooks over open flame. There is no temperature control. A joint of beef roasts on music, a spit turned by a boy whose only job is to keep it rotating for hours. The meat's music surface blackens. Fat drips into the coals and ignites. Smoke rises and clings to the flesh. In the boiling house, copper cauldrons large enough to hold a sheep simmer over fire pits. The metal is difficult to clean. Residue from previous meals lines the interior. The water inside music turns gray with scum. More than 200 workers operate this music system. At the top, the master cook who answers directly to the Lord Steward. Below him, specialized cooks for roasting, boiling, baking, then the kitchen sergeants. Then the music general staff. At the bottom, scullions. Young boys, sometimes as young as 8 or 9. Their hands are raw from scrubbing. music. They work in cold water because hot water is reserved for cooking. They clean platters still strewn with congealed fat. They scrape out cauldrons. They haul waste. The floor beneath their feet is slick with grease, blood, and water. They sleep in corners of the kitchen complex. Their reward is access to scraps, the burned crusts, the bones already boiled twice, the bits no one else music will eat. Watch a side of venison being prepared. It hangs from an iron hook in the roasting kitchen. A cook inspects it. He cuts away a section near the hunch where the flesh has started music to turn. The smell is sour. He trims it off and tosses it into a bucket. What remains goes onto the spit. It will roast for 3 hours, rotating slowly, absorbing smoke, dripping fat into the ashes below. By the time it reaches the music great hall, the outside will be charred. The inside will range from pink to grey depending on proximity to the bone. The taste will be smoke, salt, and the faint edge of something that was almost spoilage. Every piece of meat that enters Hampton Court is already in decay. The process begins the moment the animal is slaughtered. Without refrigeration, time is the enemy. Salt is the only defense. The barrels arrive from the ports and the countryside. Inside, fish packed in brine, beef submerged in salt crystals, pork layered with coarse grey salt between each cut. The meat sits in these barrels for weeks, sometimes months. The salt draws out moisture. It hardens the flesh. It changes the color from red to dark brown. Before any of this meat can be cooked, it must be soaked. Cooks submerge the pieces in cold water for hours, sometimes overnight, music trying to leach out enough salt to make the meat edible. Even after soaking, the taste is overwhelming. The texture is tough, almost leathery. You are not tasting beef. You are tasting preservation. Walk into the latter. The room is stone-walled, built on the north side of the palace where sunlight never reaches. It is cooler music here, but not cold. Sides of venison hang from iron hooks. Whole fish lie on slate shelves, wheels of cheese sit in wooden racks. The air smells of smoke, brine, and something underneath. The faint sweetness of rot that never fully disappears. Flies gather near the meat. Rats move in the shadows between the barrels. The staff inspects everything daily. They look for discoloration, for soft spots, for the telltale shine of spoilage on the surface of the flesh. When they find it, they cut it away. The rest music is sent to the kitchen. Now observe the spices. Cloves, nutmeg, ginger, pepper, saffron. They arrive in locked chests worth more by weight than the meat they season. The official explanation: they are symbols of wealth and status, the taste music of the exotic. But they serve another purpose. A heavy dose of ginger can mask the faint sourness of meat that has been in the ladder too long. Pepper burns the tongue music enough to distract from an off flavor. Saffron sweetness can cover the metallic taste of old blood. When you see a music dish arrive at the high table coated in expensive spices, you are witnessing both a display of music power and a culinary gamble. The spices announce wealth. They also hide evidence. Preservation is not perfect. It is a constant losing battle. The cooks know this. They work within a system where almost nothing is fresh. The question is not whether the food has started to turn. The question is whether enough of it can be salvaged to fill the plates in the Great Hall. The answer is always yes, because there is no alternative. The banquet must happen. The food must appear, and whatever cannot be saved is simply trimmed away and fed to the dogs. Take a seat below the salt. A servant places a trencher in front of you. A thick slab of stale bread that functions as your plate. The first dish arrives. It is a meat pie. its crust golden and decorated with pastry leaves. You break through the surface. Inside, minced pork, currants, sugar, cinnamon, and orange peel. The taste is confusing. The meat is savory, heavily salted from preservation. But the sugar is aggressive, almost cloying. The cinnamon burns at the back of your throat. The flavors do not separate. They collide. Your mouth cannot decide if this is a dessert or a meal. It is both. It is neither. This combination, strange and overwhelming to a modern palate, is normal here. The Tudors do not divide sweet from savory. A single dish contains both, often in equal measure. Now bite into the bread beneath the pie. Your teeth meet resistance, then a crunch. Not the crunch of crust, but something harder. Grit. The flour was ground between millstones. Fragments of stone broke free during the grinding and mixed into the flour. No sieve catches all of it. You're eating trace amounts of the mill itself. This is normal. Everyone at the table experiences it. You chew carefully, trying to avoid breaking a tooth. A platter of roasted peacock arrives at the high table. The bird has been skinned before roasting, then music redressed in its own feathers afterward. The head is propped up with a wooden dowel. The tail fans out behind it. The effect is music magnificent. Courtiers applaud. Servants carve into the bird and distribute portions down the table. By the time a piece reaches you, it is lukewarm. The meat is dry. Roasting for hours, music over open flame has drawn out all moisture. The flesh is stringy, difficult to tear. The taste is smoke, faintly gy music with no fat to soften it. You chew for a long time. The spectacle promises something extraordinary. The flavor delivers almost nothing. Next comes music pottage. This is what most people below the salt eat in quantity. It is a thick stew. Barley, peas, onions, scraps of meat, all boiled together in a cauldron for hours. By the time it reaches your bowl, every ingredient has lost its individual texture. The peas have disintegrated. The barley is swollen and mushy. The meat, if you can find it, falls apart at the touch of your spoon. The taste is uniform. Salt, smoke, and a faint bitterness from overboiling. There is no variation from one spoonful to the next. You eat it because it fills your stomach, not because it offers pleasure. A servant refills your cup. The ale is thick, slightly sour, and warm. It has been sitting in wooden barrels. There is sediment at the bottom of your cup. You drink it anyway. Water is unsafe. Wine is reserved for those above the salt. Ale is what remains. The final course brings a roasted capon. The skin is crisp, darkened to near black in places. You pull a piece of meat from the breast. It is tough. The bird was likely old before slaughter, then hung for days before cooking, then roasted until every bit of moisture evaporated. Your jaw works to break down the fibers. The taste is salt and character underneath faintly the flavor of the bird itself. But it is buried under the violence of preservation and music fire. You look down at your trencher. It is now soaked with grease, gravy, and fruit syrup. The bread has absorbed everything. In wealthier households, music the trencher will be given to the poor. In others, you are expected to eat it. It is sodden, falling apart in your hands, music heavy with the combined taste of every dish that touched it. You manage a few bites. It sits in your stomach like a stone. The king eats first. This is not ceremony. It is the entire structure of the meal. Henry VIII receives cuts from the center of the roast where the meat retains some moisture. The fish on his plate was swimming that morning. A servant tastes every dish before it reaches him, checking for poison but also ensuring quality. His wine is French, poured from sealed bottles. His bread is manchet, fine white flour, no grit, baked fresh in a separate oven reserved for the royal household. What he experiences is as close to palatability as to cooking allows. 10 feet from where he sits, the food is already different. Watch a platter of roasted lamb leave the high table. It was presented whole, carved in front of the king, the best portions music removed. Now a servant carries what remains toward the next rank of diners. These are nobles but lesser ones. They receive shoulder cuts, fattier and closer to the bone. The meat has been sitting exposed for 15 minutes. The surface has begun to cool and congeal. By the time it reaches their music plates, it is merely warm. They eat it with the same heavy spices, the same wine, but the meat itself has degraded. The platter moves again. Now it reaches the gentlemen ushers, the clerks, the higher servants. What they receive are end cuts, pieces near the joint where the meat is tougher and threaded with sinew. The lamb has been out of the kitchen for 30 minutes. It is no longer warm. The fat has solidified into a white film. They scrape it aside and chew carefully, working around gristle. The same animal that provided the king's tenderloin now offers them something that requires effort to swallow. Further still, the platter reaches the lower tables where esquires and junior household staff sit. They receive scraps, small fragments trimmed from around the bone, bits of crackling cartilage. The lamb is now cold. The serving dish is nearly empty, strewn with congealed drippings. They soak their bread in what remains of the juices and chew in silence. One animal, one roast, divided into 5 different experiences based purely on proximity to power. The meal music ends. Servants begin clearing the tables, but the food does not disappear. Platters that still hold anything edible are carried back toward the kitchens. What remains is sorted. Bones with meat still clinging to them go into one barrel. Bread trenches soaked with grease go into music another. Scraps of pastry, half-eaten pies, congealed pottage. All of it is collected. This is not music waste. This is arms. Outside the palace gates, people wait. They have been there since before the banquet began. Poor laborers, the elderly, the sick, mothers with children. Music they stand in the cold because they know what is coming. A servant appears carrying a large basket. Inside, the broken meats, chicken bones nearly clean. Bread so soaked with fat it falls apart when touched. Pottage that has gone cold and separated into a grey sludge. Fragments of pastry crust. A fish head with the eyes still intact. This is what remains after the court has eaten its fill. There is no line. The basket is set down and the crowd surges. Hands grab. A woman clutches a piece of fat-soaked bread. A man pulls a bone from the pile and begins scraping it with his teeth. A child receives a chunk of trencher music bread, heavy and rancid, and eats it without hesitation. They do not complain. They do not grimace. This is survival measured in the scraps of a feast they will never attend. Walk back through the process. The same pig that began as a symbol of abundance on the king's table has now traveled through every level of society. Its prime cuts fed royalty. Its tougher portions sustained nobles. Its scraps filled servants. Its bones boiled a second time became pottage for the kitchens. And what even the kitchen staff would not eat now feeds the destitute outside the gates. One animal divided and subdivided until nothing remains but fragments too small or too spoiled to justify further distribution. The Tudor banquet was never about feeding people well. It was a demonstration of control over resources so vast that waste itself became a form of power. The king could afford to eat only the best and discard the rest. The court could afford to let food degrade as it passed down the hierarchy because there was always more in the larder, more in the barrels, more animals being slaughtered in the courtyards. The poor outside could afford nothing, so they waited for garbage and called it charity. Stand at the palace gate music as the last of the broken meats are distributed. The basket is empty. The crowd disperses. Some walk away chewing. Others tuck their scraps into cloth and save them for later. A dog noses through what fell to the ground. The grand feast which began hours ago with sugar sculptures and roasted swans ends here in the mud with strangers fighting over a bone that has already been boiled twice. This is the final truth of the Tudor banquet. The food you ate was a direct measure of music you're worth. And for most people in the system, that measure was cold, spoiled, and barely edible. The spectacle existed to mask a supply chain built on salt, smoke, and rot. A system where even the king's leftovers had more value than a commoner's hunger. The Tudor banquet was not a meal. It was a machine built to demonstrate power through food that most people could barely stomach. Behind every golden platter was meat salvaged from the edge of rot, smoke poisoned in kitchens where workers could barely breathe, and seasoned with spices expensive enough to hide what preservation had music done to the flesh underneath. The sugar sculptures existed because they were the only things on music the table guaranteed not to taste like decay. What you ate depended entirely on where you sat. The king consumed the illusion. The center cuts, the fresh fish, the bread without grit. Everyone else ate the reality, music, and that reality degraded with every foot of distance from the high table. The same roasted lamb that provided tender meat to the nobles became cold sinew for the servants. And finally, a gnawed bone for the poor outside the gates. There was no refrigeration, no temperature control, no food safety, just salt, smoke, and a vast staff trained to trim away the spoiled parts and send the rest to the fire. The heavy spicing was not sophistication. It was necessity. The spectacular presentation was not artistry, it was misdirection, and the quantities were not generosity. They were a buffer against the rot that claimed a portion of every shipment before it even reached the kitchen. By the time a dish traveled from the royal table to the palace gate, it had passed through 5 different versions of itself, each one colder and more degraded than the last. The feast ended, not with celebration, but with desperate hands pulling apart greasy bread in the mud. That was the system. Music food as hierarchy made visible, where even garbage retained value because music it could feed someone lower than you. The Tudors ate this way not because they lacked knowledge but because they lacked alternatives. Preservation meant salt and smoke. Cooking meant open flame and guesswork. Storage meant accepting loss. The banquet was their solution. A spectacle large enough to absorb the waste, loud enough to drown out the taste, and cruel enough to turn music spoilage into a symbol of status. You were what you ate, and most people ate scraps.